Hey guys, it's Kate. Have you ever thought, man, I wish I could take some paint off my page? Well, that is what we are doing here today. We are going to be doing some watercolor lifting, and we're going to do both wet and dry and see how different types of paper react and what you can do, ways you can remove the paint. So if you want to learn more, stick around and we will make some tests together. So I have a couple different things to start off. So I have a spot for wet, but this is all dry to the touch. It's in here. This is a wonderful Fluid 100 block. It's 4x6 cotton cold press 140-pound paper. I have cellulose paper here. This is Artist Loft, and don't do a flat wash like this. If you want to know how to do a good one, watch my video. But I've got dry and wet here. We will do wet. I also have New York Central 100% cotton paper, and I did a couple of washes with some leftover paint in my palette, and aren't those beautiful neutrals? So let's get started with New York Central first. And so I'm going to put some wet paint on here, but in the meantime, I'm going to kind of set that there because I want to get some water drops on here so they have a minute to sit. So you can use a spray bottle and stuff like that. That will also do something similar, but just a different texture. But just because I want to have better control, I'm going to put some drops on here with a dropper, just like that, and let those sit and soak in. So in the meanwhile, I'm going to come down here and mix up a nice dark color. I'm going to make some wet marks in each of these areas, and we can see how the paint lifts with each of these materials. All right. Give my brush a rinse. Okay, first we have the baby wipe. I've got this one right here, and it is moist. So we'll see how that picks up. It might be a little bit of a softer texture, and that is how you can lift paint with that. And you can see it kind of flows back together very slowly since it's still wet, and you'll get a pretty soft effect there. Next up, I've got a damp sponge, and we will soak up some paint with that. And it's even softer than the baby wipe. You can see my paint came off right there. Next up, I'm going to use a dry tissue, and you'll see harder lines with this one because it's really going to soak up that water, just like that. Next, we're going to do water drops just like there. But if you notice, when you have kind of a damp, and this is like the cauliflower effect that you see sometimes when you have something that's damp but still starting to dry a little bit, you get that salt effect or that cauliflower effect a little bit, and you can see it growing right as we do it. And it's kind of a neat effect, especially if it's not too wet when you do it. Now, you could come back in here, let's say with a tissue, and I'll just do part of this so that you can see it really cleans up that spot when you add water and you want to remove. So that's also an option. So I'm going to set this aside and start working on this. Now, if you have paint that is dry already, you may have to work a little harder at it, but I have noticed that it really depends on the type of paper you used, and I'm saving Fluid 100 because that one I actually tend to have some difficulty with lifting. But let's start with this New York Central, and I'm going to do some scrubbing with a baby wipe. And you can see I can kind of scrub at it, which if you have cellulose paper, you may not want to do too much scrubbing because the paper might not be able to take it. But I will blot it also with a tissue. And so you can see it's a bit removed. I'll hold it up close here in a couple of minutes, but you may be able to also blot it, but you're not going to get too much up, at least not on this paper. There's not really much happening there. Now I'm going to come in this one with a damp sponge. And it lifts up fairly easily. I can come in and blot it with my tissue and get more up. And it does a little bit better than the baby wipe. Now you're not going to get it back to clean white paper usually, but that is a way you can do it. Now I'm going to take another tissue I have back here, and I'm going to see if I can dab at these water droplets and see if it does anything. And on this paper, it's very light. You can barely see it. When I hold it up close, you'll be able to see more. Last one, we're going to scrub with a damp brush. So this is a Royal & Langnickel Nocturna Pro. This is a soft scrubber watercolor brush. And so this is where you can get some finer effects. And I just dropped a water droplet on there by accident. But you can scrub at your watercolor with a damp brush and work at it that way. And this is kind of nice if you have detail work that you need to do. And the type of brush would just, that's all it would depend on, is what you actually need to do and what shape of brush you would want to have. And the more the water sits, the more difference it might make. But the paint lifts fairly well on this New York Central paper, but not so easily that you can't go over it with a second coat of paint. So it's kind of nice to know how hard you have to work on your paper to get the paint to lift as well, because then you know what you can do if you don't want it to lift, how gentle you have to be. So I'm going to hold this up for a close-up. And you can see the difference between the baby wipe and the damp sponge, scrubbing with a brush, and very slight hints where the water drops were. You can see where I dabbed at that. Now, if I wanted to scrub with something, that'd be another story. I could get up more paint. And then this is pretty much dry. So you can see the baby wipe, the damp sponge. You can see the tissue with the more pronounced texture there, and you can see the effect of the water drops. So next up, let's try Artist Loft. Now, Artist Loft is kind of the opposite. It is so easy to take up paint from this paper that it's actually hard to lay down a second coat of paint when you're painting, because it just tends to lift up as you're painting. And I think part of it is the paint and the water tend to sit on top of this paper versus soak into it like you have with the cotton paper that I was using. But before we do that, let's get some fresh paint on here and we'll go through and do the wet removal. And I'm just going to get some fast color down on this page, semi-even. And we'll go through. So I'm going to grab my tissue, find a dry spot that's clean. So that is tissue removal. Get my damp baby wipe. Here's baby wipe. Here is damp sponge. And we'll do a few water drops. And I'm just going to dip my brush right on there and let that spread out. Okay, let's do some dry removal. First, I'm going to put a few water droplets, and this is a little bit uneven, so I'm going to try to avoid that area so it doesn't give any type of false conclusion since there's already some marks there. So I'm going to put some water drops right next to it with my brush and let those sit there. And then I'm going to do my damp brush scrubbing, and you can see, like, I can kind of swipe at it, reactivates the paint and wipes it off almost immediately. So it would not be all that hard probably to get to clean white paper on this. And you can see just how easily that comes up. And if I keep scrubbing it, rinse my brush, and do some more scrubbing, I can make a very clean lift. But also, it lifts so easily. You have to be really careful when you're painting second coats, because when you paint over it, it just is so easy to lift it. And it can, if you're not careful, mess up what you spent so much time working on. Okay, next up, let's try the baby wipe. And you can see that lifts right up too. And if I use like a cleaner part of the baby wipe, now you'll see some kind of roughness there. That's from my scrubbing, I think, where you'll see that it starts to break down the cellulose paper a little bit. Now with the sponge, it actually comes up even easier. And so let me get that blotted too. Okay. So I'll do a little close up here. We go. Actually, I forgot about my water droplets. I gotta blot those off. Okay, got them. Now you can see just with the water sitting there for a minute, that's how it looks. That was our damp brush, our baby wipe, our sponge. This was the dry tissue on the wet paint, and I believe that was our baby wipe and our sponge, and that was water droplets. Now, last but not least, I want to go over my Fluid 100. First, I'm going to put some paint on this side. Actually, first, I'm going to put some water droplets right here on top. Just like that. Okay, let me go in with my paint on this other side. Okay. Now, let's do the dry tissue. And that comes up pretty well when it's still damp. Let's do the damp sponge. The damp sponge makes some marks, but not a ton. And then let's try the damp baby wipe. Okay. And just for some extra measure, let's come in here with a couple of water droplets. And those are pretty obvious. You can see them cauliflowering out almost immediately. And if I wanted to go in with just a little corner of my tissue and blot one of those water droplets, that might be the best way to release the paint from this paper. Now, let's go over to this side. Let's first blot up this water with my dry tissue. And you can see a very slight effect there. I'll hold it up for a close-up. Okay, now to scrub with my brush. Now, I really wanted to test this one because there was another painting I had worked on, because this paper is new to me. I've used probably 3 or 4 sheets out of it. And one of the times I actually was trying to scrub up color and had a really hard time. It just did not want to move for me. And I don't know if it was that particular color I was working on maybe, or what. So it looks like it comes up a little, but I don't think it comes up as much as my New York Central. And it kind of leaves this sort of texture behind. And I'm scrubbing this pretty good. and it's just lightening a very small amount. Now I'm going to see if anything happens if I rub at it with a damp sponge. All right. Maybe the sponge will work better. I actually hadn't tried that on this paper before. And actually, yeah, the sponge works much better than a brush in this instance. So that's much better. Okay. I can get on board with that. Okay, let's try the baby wipe. I'm going to get a clean part of it and start scrubbing away. And the baby wipe does not do well and leaves it very splotchy. Okay, let's bring this up so you can see the close-up. So there is our water droplets on the Fluid 100. You can see the very faint outline. That is scrubbing with a brush, scrubbing with a sponge, which is probably the best way if you wanted to remove paint, but you can't get I don't know, you can't get very detailed with that. It's got to be kind of a, really rubbing it in there. And then the baby wipe kind of leaves this weird, almost like a residue. It's not really a residue. I'm not sure what that is. And on this side, you can see the wet and wet. So that is where I blotted after dropping a drop of water in it. Dry tissue, sponge, and baby wipe on this side. So I hope that gives you some ideas on what you can do with lifting watercolor, and I hope you experiment with your paper and just see what it really takes and how you can treat it, how much you can scrub. For instance, if you use Artist Loft, I would say be very gentle when you're lifting paint. It's too easy to lift. So having that middle ground with a paper you can work with, and you might lift paint to paint if you wanted to have a light background to another color. You can put in highlights. Since watercolor is so transparent, you can do a lot of cool stuff with paint lifting and add some really neat textures. So it's definitely something to experiment with. And as you can see, the kind of paper you use can really vary the results. So definitely take a couple of sheets of yours that you normally work with and get to know it very well. And do some experiments like this and just see what the results are. And you can incorporate that into your painting. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, please give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for watching. And until next time, keep creating.